America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Man and His Symbols, edited by Carl Jung. And it's not just edited by Carl Jung. He wrote an essay here, the introduction, but it's pretty lengthy, so I feel like it's more like the same size or even longer as the rest of the essays in the book. So he wrote a sizable portion, but he also was the editor, selected the works here. And this was, I believe, his last book, or among his last books, 1964. He actually died while he was editing it, so von Franz was a student of his. Marie-Louise von Franz, a close friend of Jung's, finished the book. So this was very late in his life. And he wants to give a bird's eye view. And it's stated, I believe, in on the back cover here, in a quote from The Guardian, that this is his first attempt to present his life work in psychology to a non-technical public. I don't think that's true. He also wrote Modern Man in Search of a Soul, which was directed at the general public. And I think it was kind of an overview, but it wasn't as much of an overview. There were more, like, each essay had its own particular thing about the modern world that he wanted to talk about. So it wasn't as much of an overview of his total worldview, but it did have some of that in it. But this is, I guess, his last and greatest attempt to just summarize everything in one big essay that is approachable, is not exceedingly long, less than 100 pages, and just easy to comprehend for the general public, not for a technical audience. And so that's the essay that I want to cover today. There are other essays in this, 4 other essays. I do want to do another episode in the future to cover those. I really could do, honestly, they're all pretty good. I could do an episode on each of them, but I don't think that would be the best idea. You should pick this book up and read them for yourself. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend Jung in general, but if you're looking for an introduction to Jung, this is a great book because it's his bird's eye view and then 4 other people, and you get to see where other people take it. But like I said, I just want to cover the first essay, which is his introduction. And it's not really an introduction. His essay is called Approaching the Unconscious. So like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections here, provide a little bit of commentary about what I've read, and just use this as an opportunity to introduce you to the works of Carl Jung. One thing that Jung talks about a lot is dreams. As a psychoanalyst, he analyzes people's dreams. He was a student of Freud. Freud analyzed people's dreams. And so Carl Jung follows in their footsteps, analyzing people's dreams. I'm not all that into dream analysis. I find it kind of interesting. I like my dreams. They're interesting. I like hearing about other people's dreams, the strangeness of them, and how it all seems so normal at the time. Or sometimes it seems radically abnormal, almost frighteningly abnormal at times. Dreams are interesting, and their window into the unconscious is interesting as well. My interests tend to be more in the mythology of the group than the dreams of the individual. But there's certainly crossover between mythology and psychoanalysis, and especially Jungian psychoanalysis. Concepts from mythology pop up repeatedly in the dreams that get analyzed, and in the myths, and in the psychosis, and in the unconscious, in the artwork and the poetry and everything else. There's a lot of crossover between all these different areas. But the intersection between psychology and mythology is a super interesting one. So here, when he talks about dreams, he says the following, quote, "One cannot afford to be naive in dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human, but is rather a breath of nature, spirit of the beautiful and generous, as well as of the cruel goddess. If we want to characterize this spirit, we shall certainly get closer to it in the sphere of ancient mythologies, or the fables of the primeval forest, than in the consciousness of modern man. I am not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. Part of the purpose of my comparisons between the primitive and the civilized states of man has been to show the balance of these losses and gains. Primitive man was much more concerned by his instincts than are his rational modern descendants, who have learned to control themselves. In this civilizing process, we have increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis of the psychic phenomenon. Fortunately, we have not lost these basic instinctive strata. They remain part of the unconscious, even though they may express themselves only in the form of dream images. These instinctive phenomena, one may not incidentally always recognize them for what they are, for their character is symbolic, play a vital role in what I have called the compensating function of dreams. For the sake of mental stability, and even physiological health, the unconscious and the conscious must be integrally connected, and thus move on parallel lines. If they are split apart or dissociated, psychological disturbance follows. In this respect, dream symbols are the essential message carriers from the instinctive to the rational parts of the human mind, and their interpretation enriches the poverty of consciousness so that it learns to understand, again, the forgotten language of the instincts. Of course, people are bound to query this function, since its symbols so often pass unnoticed or uncomprehended. In normal life, the understanding of dreams is often considered superfluous. I can illustrate this by my experience with a primitive tribe in East Africa. To my amazement, these tribesmen denied that they had any dreams. But through patient, indirect talks with them, I soon found that they had dreams, just like everyone else, but that they were convinced their dreams had no meaning. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they told me. They thought that the only dreams that mattered were those of chiefs and medicine men. These, which concerned the welfare of the tribe, were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief and the medicine man both claimed that they had ceased having meaningful dreams. They dated this change from the time that the British came to their country. The district commissioner, the British official in charge of them, had taken over the function of the great dreams that had hitherto guided the tribe's behavior. When these tribesmen conceded that they did have dreams but thought them meaningless, they were like the modern man who thinks that a dream has no significance for him, simply because he does not understand it. But even a civilized man can sometimes observe that a dream, which he may not even remember, can alter his mood, for better or worse. The dream has been comprehended, but only in a subliminal way. And that is what usually happens. It is only on the rare occasions when a dream is particularly impressive, or repeats itself at regular intervals, that most people consider an interpretation desirable." End quote. So I like that brief introduction in where he... Well, I mean, I say introduction. This is like over 30 pages into the essay. But he begins to talk about mythology a little bit in the start and consciousness. He says basically that that dreams originate in a spirit not quite human. He says we can't afford to be naive dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human. And this spirit is, if we want to get close to understanding the spirit that is the origin source of dreams, we get closer to it in the sphere of ancient mythologies or the fables of the primeval forest. Modern man's consciousness doesn't provide us with a view of the spirit that dreams originate from, because it is instinctive, and modern man has separated himself from his instincts. And so it's a kind of biological. And he says we've not only separated ourselves from our instincts, but he says we've increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis of the psychic phenomenon. Somatic meaning physical, meaning essentially biological. And that's, of course, the calculating mind is not rooted in instinctive drives. And it's built off of them, but our minds go much further than just the playground of competing instincts, or at least it seems to. And we lose sight of the instincts themselves, and they manifest to us in different ways. He says, we've not lost these basic instinctive strata. They remain a part of the unconscious. So the unconscious mind is where we go to get in touch with the biological components of the instinctive brain. I think that's an important thing to keep in point. It's not Jung is not weird hocus pocus mysticism. It's ultimately saying that the brain is a biological phenomena. It's an instinct driven, just like animals are instinct driven. We're instinct driven. And the unconscious mind is where the instincts get sort of set aside, while our civilized higher mind does what it does. So let me move from there to where he talks about symbols. And he says, quote, "Symbols are natural and spontaneous products. No genius has ever sat down with a pen or a brush in his hand and said, 'Now I am going to invent a symbol.' No one can take a more or less rational thought, reached as a logical conclusion or by deliberate intent, and then give it symbolic form. No matter what fantastic trappings one may put upon an idea of this kind, it will still remain a sign, linked to that conscious thought behind it, not a symbol that hints at something not yet known. In dreams, symbols occur spontaneously, for dreams happen and are not invented. They are therefore the main source of all our knowledge about symbolism. But symbols, I must point out, do not occur solely in dreams. They appear in all kinds of psychic manifestations. There are symbolic thoughts and feelings, symbolic acts and situations. It often seems that even inanimate objects cooperate with the unconscious in the arrangement of symbolic patterns. There are numerous well-authenticated stories of clocks stopping at the moment of their owner's death. One was the pendulum clock in the palace of Frederick the Great at Sans Souci, which stopped when the emperor died. Other common examples are those of a mirror that breaks or a picture that falls when a death occurs, or minor but unexplained breakages in a house when someone is passing through an emotional crisis. Even if skeptics refuse to credit such reports, stories of this kind are always cropping up, and this alone should serve as ample proof of their psychological importance. There are many symbols, however, among them the most important, that are not individual, but collective in their nature and origin. These are chiefly religious images. The believer assumes that they are of divine origin, that they have been revealed to man. Both are wrong. It is true, as the skeptic notes, that religious symbols and concepts have for centuries been the object of careful and quite conscious elaboration. It is equally true, as the believer implies, that their origin is so far buried in the mystery of the past that they seem to have no human source. But they are, in fact, collective representations, emanating from primeval dreams and creative fantasies. As such, these images are involuntary, spontaneous manifestations, and by no means intentional inventions. This fact, as I shall later explain, has a direct and important bearing upon the interpretation of dreams. It is obvious that if you assume the dream to be symbolic, you will interpret differently from a person who believes that any essential energizing thought or emotion is known already and is merely disguised by the dream. In the latter case, dream interpretation makes little sense, for you find only what you already know. It is for this reason that I have always said to my pupils, learn as much as you can about symbolism. Then, forget it all when you are analyzing a dream. This advice is of such practical importance that I have made it a rule to remind myself that I can never understand somebody else's dream well enough to interpret it correctly. I have done this in order to check the flow of my own associations and reactions, which might otherwise prevail over my patient's uncertainties and hesitations. As it is of the greatest therapeutic importance for an analyst to get the particular message of a dream, that is, the contribution that the unconscious is making to the conscious mind, as accurate as possible, it is essential for him to explore the content of a dream with the utmost thoroughness. End quote. Okay, so here we have a couple important points. The first of which is that there's a symbol and then there is a sign, and they're not the same. There was a little bit before where I started reading where we talked a little bit more about that, but essentially the symbols don't get created. They don't get intentionally created. They're natural and spontaneous products. No one sits down with a pen or brush in his hand and says, I'm going to make a symbol. Nobody can take irrational thoughts and give them symbolic form. The only thing they can do is make signs that stand for things known. You craft a sign and say, this symbol means this. I use the word symbol because in common language we use that word symbol all the time to mean what he essentially is saying is a sign. When he uses the word symbol, he means something very specific. It's difficult sometimes to keep that in mind because, as I just made obvious, we throw the word symbol around pretty easily. But he means something that's representing something that you don't know, and you would have to investigate the symbol to understand or arrive at the truth behind it. He says dreams happen and they're not invented, and so for that reason, dreams are the main source of all of our knowledge about symbolism. But he points out that it's not just dreams. Thoughts, feelings, acts, situations, and then he starts to go off on a strange direction where he says, the clock stops sometimes when people die, or a mirror breaks, or other things happen at the moment of death. And these material objects, these inanimate objects, cooperate in the symbolism, which is, kind of an oddly like coincidences mean something more, that goes outside of our normal understanding of the way reality works. And I tend to be skeptical of that. And I think the older I get, the more skeptical I get about that sort of thing being real. But Jung seems to think that it's something that's worth investigating and worth discussing. He talks about it here and he talks about it elsewhere as well a little bit. Synchronicity, he calls it. But aside from that, he says, either way, the symbols appear in collective form as well, not just individual. A symbol in your dream is something that your own subconscious mind is assembling, creating, or is a participant in the creation of the symbol. But there are other symbols that are collective, and these mainly come about in the world of religion, and their origin is outside of the conscious human creation. They've been tweaked over the years, but they maintain some component that is from the unconscious. And I think religions are constantly refreshed by content from the unconscious. People's visions and their intuitions and their feelings and their dreams and their daydreams and their thoughts in general about religion are constantly influencing like the set of symbols that make up religions. Religious memes sweep the land. But he also makes a point to say that you can never completely interpret a dream, and especially you can never completely interpret somebody else's dream. He always has to remind himself not to insert his own biases and associations into other people's dreams. And then he goes on a little bit later to talk about archetypes. And I'm going to pick up there where he says, quote, "The dream is a normal psychic phenomena that transmits unconscious reactions or spontaneous impulses to consciousness. Many dreams can be interpreted with the help of the dreamer, who provides both the associations to and the context of the dream image, by means of which one can look at all its aspects. This method is adequate in all ordinary cases, such as those when a relative, a friend, or a patient tells you a dream more or less in the course of conversation. But when it is a matter of obsessive dreaming, or of highly emotional dreams, the personal associations produced by the dreamer do not usually suffice for a satisfactory interpretation. In such cases, we have to take into consideration the fact, first observed and commented on by Freud, that elements often occur in a dream that are not individual and that cannot be derived from the dreamer's personal experience. These elements, as I have previously mentioned, are what Freud called archaic remnants, mental forms whose presence cannot be explained by anything in the individual's own life, and which seem to be aboriginal, innate, and inherited shapes of the human mind. Just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with a long evolutionary history behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. It can no more be a product without history than is the body in which it exists. By history, I do not mean the fact that the mind builds itself up by conscious reference to the past, through language and other cultural traditions. I am referring to the biological, prehistoric, and unconscious development of the mind in archaic man, whose psyche was still close to that of the animal. This immensely old psyche forms the basis of our mind, just as much as the structure of our body is based on the general anatomical pattern of the mammal. The trained eye of the anatomist or the biologist finds many traces of this original pattern in our bodies. The experienced investigator of the mind can similarly see the analogies between the dream pictures of modern man and the products of the primitive mind, its collective images and its mythological motifs. Just as the biologist needs the science of comparative anatomy, however, the psychologist cannot do without a comparative anatomy of the psyche. In practice, to put it differently, the psychologist must not only have a sufficient experience of dreams and other products of unconscious activity, but also of mythology in its widest sense. Without this equipment, nobody can spot the important analogies. It is not possible, for instance, to see the analogy between a case of compulsion neurosis and that of a classical demonic possession, without a working knowledge of both. My views about the archaic remnants, which I call archetypes or primordial images, have been constantly criticized by people who lack a sufficient knowledge of the psychology of dreams and of mythology. The term archetype is often misunderstood as meaning certain definite mythological images or motifs. But these are nothing more than conscious representations. It would be absurd to assume that such variable representations could be inherited. The archetype is a tendency to form such representations of a motif, representations that can vary a great deal in detail without losing their basic pattern. There are, for instance, many representations of the motif of the hostile brethren, but the motif itself remains the same. My critics have incorrectly assumed that I am dealing with inherited representations, and on that ground they have dismissed the idea of the archetype as mere superstition. They have failed to take into account the fact that if archetypes were representations that originated in our consciousness, or were acquired by consciousness, we should surely understand them, and not be bewildered and astonished when they present themselves in our consciousness. They are indeed an instinctive trend, as marked as the impulse of birds to build nests, or ants to form organized colonies. Here I must clarify the relation between instincts and archetypes. What we properly call instincts are physiological urges and are perceived by the senses. But at the same time, they also manifest themselves in fantasies, and often reveal their presence only by symbolic images. These manifestations are what I call the archetypes. They are without known origin, and they reproduce themselves in any time or in any part of the world, even where transmission by direct descent or cross-fertilization through migration must be ruled out. I can remember many cases of people who have consulted me because they were baffled by their own dreams, or by their children's. They were at a complete loss to understand the terms of the dreams. The reason was that the dream contained images that they could not relate to anything they could remember, or could have passed on to their children. Yet some of these patients were highly educated. A few of them were actually psychiatrists themselves. End quote. So this is the archetype a bit here, and he talks about the archaic remnants coined by Freud. He says you can't just understand a dream by the particular associations that the dreamer has, what he has to say about it, what certain things, the associations alone are not enough. There's some underlying infrastructure of the mind that you have to understand. He says, like the body is a bunch of organs, and each organ has an evolutionary history behind it. The mind is also a structure with organs, shapes, functions with evolutionary history behind them, and a bit of understanding of the physiology of the mind, if you will, is helpful to people to the interpretation of dreams and to the understanding of people's psychological states. He says, just like the biologist needs the science of comparative anatomy, the psychologist cannot do without a comparative anatomy of the psyche. And so here we also need to know about mythology, because the components of the archetypes represent themselves in mythology. And so the archetype really is the underlying motif that forms, like the hostile brethren, as an example he gives, the sort of motif that lies underneath particular manifestations in mythology. And so in the same sense that hostile brethren might make an appearance in the dream, it also makes an appearance in myths. And there are common components all across the world where migration or direct descent can be clearly ruled out, because they keep popping up in different cultures because they are shared biological features. So jumping forward from there a little bit, he talks about the collective unconscious. So in this next section, he does talk about a series of dreams. He references a series of dreams. I'm not going to go into them. They're from a prior section where a little girl had a bunch of dreams, and I guess she wrote them out, and I think she might have even illustrated them. She gave them to her father as a Christmas present, and they made their way to Jung, and they're very interesting and filled with religious imagery. It was pretty cool, but he references that in just the depths of the symbols that come forward into her dreams. He says, quote, "One can perceive the special energy of archetypes when we experience the peculiar fascination that accompanies them. They seem to hold a special spell. Such a peculiar quality is also characteristic of the personal complexes, and just as personal complexes have their individual history, so do social complexes of an archetypal character. But while personal complexes never produce more than a personal bias, archetypes create myths, religions, and philosophies that influence and characterize whole nations and epochs of history. We regard the personal complexes as compensations for one-sided or faulty attitudes of consciousness. In the same way, myths of a religious nature can be interpreted as a sort of mental therapy for the sufferings and anxieties of mankind in general: hunger, war, disease, old age, death. The universal hero myth, for example, always refers to a powerful man or God-man who vanquishes evil in the form of dragons, serpents, monsters, demons, and so on, and who liberates his people from destruction and death. The narration or ritual repetition of sacred texts and ceremonies and the worship of such a figure with dances, music, hymns, prayers, and sacrifices grip the audience with numinous emotions as if with magic spells, and exalt the individual to an identification with the hero. If we try to see such a situation with the eyes of the believer, we can perhaps understand how the ordinary man can be liberated from his personal impotence and misery and endowed, at least temporarily, with an almost superhuman quality. Often enough, such conviction will sustain him for a long time and give a certain style to his life. It may even set the tone of a whole society. A remarkable instance of this can be found in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were finally suppressed in the beginning of the 7th century of the Christian era. They expressed, together with the Delphic oracle, the essence and spirit of ancient Greece. On a much greater scale, the Christian era itself owes its name and significance to the antique mystery of the God-man, which has its roots in the archetypal Osiris-Horus myth of ancient Egypt. It is commonly assumed that on some given occasion in prehistoric times, the basic mythological ideas were invented by a clever old philosopher or prophet, and ever afterward believed by a credulous and uncritical people. It is said that stories told by a power-seeking priesthood are not true, but merely wishful thinking. But the very word invent is derived from the Latin invenire and means to find, and hence to find something by seeking it. In the latter case, the word itself hints at some foreknowledge of what you are going to find. Let me go back to the strange ideas contained in the dreams of the little girl. It seems unlikely that she sought them out, since she was surprised to find them. They occurred to her rather as peculiar and unexpected stories, which seemed noteworthy enough to be given to her father as a Christmas present. In doing so, however, she lifted them up into the sphere of our still living Christian mystery, the birth of our Lord, mixed with the secret of the evergreen tree that carries the newborn light. This is a reference to the 5th dream. Although there is ample historical evidence for the symbolic relation between Christ and the tree symbol, the little girl's parents would have been gravely embarrassed had they been asked to explain exactly what they meant by decorating a tree with burning candles to celebrate the nativity of Christ. "Oh, it's just a Christmas custom," they would have said. A serious answer would require a far-reaching dissertation about the antique symbolism of the dying God and its relation to the cult of the Great Mother and her symbol, the tree, to mention only one aspect of this complicated problem. The further we delve into the origins of a collective image, or to express it in ecclesiastical language of a dogma, the more we uncover a seemingly unending web of archetypal patterns that before modern times were never the object of conscious reflection. Thus, paradoxically enough, we know more about mythological symbolism than did any generation before our own. The fact is that in former times men did not reflect upon their symbols, they lived them, and they were unconsciously animated by their meaning. End quote. So I want to jump forward from that and look at another part where I think he opens up a pragmatic line of inquiry. I think there's just echoes of pragmatic philosophy here. Maybe it's my imagination. He seems like he asks about the pragmatic functions of archetypes and functions of the unconscious mind and things of that sort. He says, quote, Goethe's Faust aptly says, "In the beginning was the deed. Deeds were never invented, they were done. Thoughts, on the other hand, are a relatively late discovery of man. First he was moved to deeds by unconscious factors. It was only a long time afterward that he began to reflect upon the causes that had moved him, and it took him a very long time indeed to arrive at the preposterous idea that he must have moved himself, his mind being unable to identify any other motivating force than his own. We should laugh at the idea of a plant or an animal inventing itself, yet there are many people who believe that the psyche or mind invented itself, and thus was the creator of its own existence. As a matter of fact, the mind has grown to the present state of consciousness as an acorn grows into an oak, or as saurians developed into mammals. As it has for so long been developing, so it still develops. And thus we are moved by forces from within, as well as by stimuli from without. These inner motives spring from a deep source that is not made by consciousness and is not under our control. In the mythology of earlier times, these forces were called mana, or spirits, demons, and gods. They are as active today as they ever were. If they conform to our wishes, we call them happy hunches or impulses and pat ourselves on the back for being smart fellows. If they go against us, we say that it was just bad luck, or that certain people are against us, or that the cause of our misfortunes must be pathological. The one thing we refuse to admit is that we are dependent upon powers that are beyond our control. It is true, however, that in recent times, civilized man has acquired a certain amount of willpower, which he can apply where he pleases. He has learned to do his work efficiently, without having recourse to chanting and drumming to hypnotize him into the state of doing. He can even dispense with a daily prayer for divine aid. He can carry out what he proposes to do, and he can apparently translate his ideas into action without a hitch, whereas the primitive seems to be hampered at every step by fears, superstitions, and other unseen obstacles to action. The motto, "Where there's a will, there's a way," is the superstition of modern man. Yet, in order to sustain his creed, contemporary man pays the price in a remarkable lack of introspection. He is blind to the fact that, with all his rationality and efficiency, he is possessed by powers that are beyond his control. His gods and demons have not disappeared at all, they have merely got new names. They keep him on the run with restlessness, vague apprehensions, psychological complications, an insatiable need for pills, alcohol, tobacco, food, and above all, a large array of neuroses. What we call civilized consciousness has steadily separated itself from the basic instincts. But these instincts have not disappeared, they have merely lost their contact with our consciousness and are thus forced to assert themselves in an indirect fashion. This may be by means of physical symptoms in the case of a neurosis, or by means of incidents of various kinds, like unaccountable moods, unexpected forgetfulness, or mistakes in speech. A man likes to believe that he is the master of his soul, but as long as he is unable to control his moods and emotions, or to be conscious of the myriad secret ways in which unconscious factors insinuate themselves into his arrangements and decisions, he is certainly not his own master. These unconscious factors owe their existence to the autonomy of the archetypes. Modern man protects himself against seeing his own split state by a system of compartments. Certain areas of outer life and of his own behavior are kept, as it were, in separate drawers and are never confronted with one another. End quote. He's kind of talking about how, like, our gods are still alive in a way, right? He says in the mythology of earlier times, well, he says that there are sources, the inner motives that drive us, our instincts. He says these spring from a deep source that is not made by consciousness and is not under its control. So an instinctive part of the inner self, the inner mind, I mean, you can call it the mind, but as long as you keep calling it the mind, it seems as though it's really something that your consciousness does have access to in a way if it wanted it. If I wanted to, like, open those drawers and doors, I could see what's in there. It's just like this readily accessible part of the mind, but I think it's deeper than that, and so maybe using the word mind as a part, as like a subconscious mind, part of the mind, maybe isn't the right word, but there's some area of your brain, we'll call it your brain, where there are forces that shape your consciousness and shape your behavior more than your consciousness. They're like underlying your consciousness, but they're also like underlying your behavior and your likes and dislikes and things like that. So what's the pragmatic quality here? I suppose that if you really, ask, well, where do they come from? It's clearly that they come from our biology, and it's clear that they're instinctually driven. They're something that we have acquired through evolution, and so they're hardwired there. And as we enter modernity, he talks about contemporary man has a remarkable lack of introspection, but he says these things don't go away. He says his gods and demons have not disappeared at all. They have merely got new names. So these unconscious parts of the mind continue to operate. We can't get rid of them. They operate in new ways. They take on new names, new forms, new images, new definitions and things, but there are something continuous, an underlying motif or archetype underneath these that are continuous, even into modernity. And so if we say that they're evolutionarily acquired, well, we can only presume that they serve a function. And so I think as long as modern man doesn't have a recognition, he says if modern man doesn't recognize himself, he can't really call himself his own master if he doesn't recognize himself and doesn't understand the unconscious urges and have some sort of control over them. He says a man likes to believe he's the master of his soul, but if he's unable to control his moods and emotions or to be conscious of the myriad secret ways in which unconscious factors insinuate themselves into his arrangements and decisions, he's certainly not his own master. So they exist there for a reason. You want to be the master of them, but you also want to understand them and why they exist, right? You don't want to impede yourself, in order to be the master of yourself, any more than you should injure your own body in order to prove that you're the master of your body. It's obvious that you're the master of your body. You don't need to injure yourself to prove it. Or maybe not. Maybe if you won't injure yourself, you're not really the master of your body. I guess when it comes right down to it, your body's the master of you, because your brain is a part of your body. The point is that the archetypes, the instincts, they all exist for a reason. I mean, when we talk about pragmatism, we're talking about the fact that our minds operate in certain ways because it's functional, because it works, right? The output is good, the consequences are good. That's, in a sense, why pragmatism and evolution are bound up together. We have the archetypes because they work, because their output, their outcome, their consequences have been successful in the past for our ancestors. And so because of that, I think it's important to understand that we neglect our instincts at our own peril. We neglect our archetypes at our own peril because they've served our forefathers well. So anyway, moving forward from there, he gets into modern myths a little bit. He says, quote, "If for a moment we regard mankind as one individual, we see that the human race is like a person carried away by unconscious powers. And the human race also likes to keep certain problems tucked away in separate drawers. But this is why we should give a great deal of consideration to what we are doing. For mankind is now threatened by self-created and deadly dangers that are growing beyond our control. Our world is, so to speak, dissociated, like a neurotic, with the Iron Curtain marking the symbolic line of division. Western man, becoming aware of the aggressive will to power of the East, sees himself forced to take extraordinary measures of defense. At the same time, he prides himself on his virtue and good intentions. What he fails to see is that it is his own vices, which he has covered up by good international manners, that are thrown back in his face by the communist world, shamelessly and methodically. What the West has tolerated, but secretly and with a slight sense of shame, the diplomatic lie, systematic deception, veiled threats, come back into the open and in full measure from the East, and ties us up in neurotic knots. It is the face of his own evil shadow that grins at Western man from the other side of the Iron Curtain. It is this state of affairs that explains the peculiar feeling of helplessness, of so many people in Western societies. They have begun to realize that the difficulties confronting us are moral problems, and that the attempts to answer them by a policy of piling up nuclear arms or by economic competition is achieving little, for it cuts both ways. Many of us now understand that moral and mental means would be more efficient, since they could provide us with psychic immunity against the ever-increasing infection. But all such attempts have proved singularly ineffective, and will do so as long as we try to convince ourselves and the world that it is only they, i.e. our opponents, who are wrong. It would be much more to the point for us to make a serious attempt to recognize our own shadow and its nefarious doings. If we could see our shadow, the dark side of our nature, we should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. As matters now stand, we lay ourselves open to every infection, because we are really doing practically the same thing as they. Only we have the additional disadvantage that we neither see nor want to understand what we ourselves are doing, under the cover of good manners. The communist world, it may be noted, has one big myth, which we call an illusion in the vain hope that our superior judgment will make it disappear. It is the time-hallowed archetypal dream of a golden age, or paradise, where everything is provided in abundance for everyone, and a great, just, and wise chief rules over a human kindergarten. This powerful archetype, in its infantile form, has gripped them, but it will never disappear from the world at the mere sight of our superior points of view. We even support it with our own childishness, for our Western civilization is in the grip of the same mythology. Unconsciously, we cherish the same prejudices, hopes, and expectations. We too believe in the welfare state, in universal peace, in the equality of man, his eternal human rights, in justice, truth, and do not say it too loudly, in the kingdom of God on earth. The sad truth is that man's real life consists of a complex of inexorable opposites: day and night, birth and death, happiness and misery, good and evil. We are not even sure that one will prevail against the other, that good will overcome evil, or joy defeat pain. Life is a battleground. It always has been, and always will be. And if it were not so, existence would come to an end. It was precisely this conflict within man that led the early Christians to expect and hope for an early end to the world, or the Buddhists to reject all the earthly desires and aspirations. These basic answers would be frankly suicidal if they were not linked up with peculiar mental and moral ideas and practices that constitute the bulk of both religions, and that, to a certain extent, modify their radical denial of the world. I stress this point because in our time there are millions of people who have lost faith in any kind of religion. Such people do not understand their religion any longer. While life runs smoothly without religion, this loss remains as good as unnoticed, but when suffering comes, it is another matter. That is when people begin to seek a way out and to reflect about the meaning of life and its bewildering and painful experiences." End quote. So he starts to get into religion a little bit at the end there, but it's interesting to get a look in here because, as I said, he talks a little bit about modern myths, but these are the modern myths of the era when he wrote, and this book was published, as I said, 1964, during the Cold War. So it's a little bit dated in what is modern for him, but he talks a bit about the psychology, and he says that we've got a shadow. The West has a shadow of the dark side of our international affairs, and that the East has the same darkness in their affairs, and so it's like our shock at what they do is only just our own shadow looking back at us. And he says we would be better off if we recognize our own shadow and its nefarious doings. He says if we could see our shadow, the dark side of our nature, we should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. Immune to a mind virus if we see our shadow, the dark side of our nature. I don't know. One wonders how much the sort of viewing the dark side of our culture is itself a window, a gateway that the mind, through which the mind virus enters. Is it an inoculation that you acquire? Maybe. But it's also like people get one-shotted because if they're too, if they're starting from a position of naivety, I guess, which maybe describes the boomers as kids in the 50s, starting from a state of naivety and then quickly being disillusioned. Somebody like that would be more prone to the woke mind virus. If you're inoculated as a sort of nihilist, there's an article in the New York Times recently about right-wing nihilism, and one wonders if you're inoculated at a young age to seeing the dark side of Western culture. It doesn't have quite the impact, and maybe it can serve as inoculation, but it would have to be inoculation is a he says you can inoculate Western civilization to not have mental infection. We should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. He says, as matters now stand, we lay ourselves open to every infection because we are really practically doing the same thing as they, only we have the additional disadvantage that we neither see nor want to understand what we ourselves are doing under the cover of good manners. So we're ignorant about our own dark international dealings. And so that ignorance leaves one in a sort of vulnerable state, I guess is his point when he talks about mental infection. Ignorance of our own dark side, like the shadow of if we could see our own shadow, the dark side of our nature. Now, is that just individual? Well, he's talking about the Cold War here. He says, many of us now understand that moral and mental means would be more efficient since they could provide us with psychic immunity against the ever-increasing infection. And he seems to be saying that piling up nuclear arms or economic competition is not going to work. We have to have a moral and mental conflict. We strengthen ourselves with moral and mental means. He said that's what he says. We understand, many of us now understand that moral and mental means would be more efficient. And the communist world is living in a myth, the myth of the Golden Age, which he describes as a childish myth. Kindergarten, a wise chief who rules over a human kindergarten. That almost seems like an attack on Plato. A powerful archetype in an infantile form has gripped the communist world. He says the sad truth is that man's real life is a complex of inexorable opposites. Day and night, birth, death, happiness, misery, good, evil. The endless struggle between competing forces. Life is a battleground. It always has been and it always will be. Like black-pilled Carl Jung. If it were not so, existence would come to an end. War is the father of all things. Conflict between polarities. He says both Christian and Buddhist, early Christian and Buddhists attempted to reject all earthly desires to escape from the struggle of existence. And he says that would be suicidal if it wasn't linked up. He says that these basic answers would be frankly suicidal if they were not linked up with the peculiar mental and moral ideas and practices that constitute the bulk of both religions. That doesn't really sound like a selling point, that religion provides cover for suicidal ideas. Doesn't sound like religion inoculates one against ridiculous ideas at all. It sounds like religion is a carrier of suicidal ideas. He says, I stress this point because in our time there are millions of people who have lost faith in any kind of religion. Such people do not understand their religion any longer. When life runs smoothly without religion, nobody notices, but when suffering comes, it's another matter. People seek out religion as a way to reflect about the meaning of life and its bewildering and painful experiences. then obviously he believes that religion serves a functional, helpful purpose as well. Helps people get through suffering times and helps people get through difficult challenges. He talks more about religion when he says, quote, "Because we cannot discover God's throne in the sky with a radio telescope or establish for certain that a beloved father or mother is still about in a more or less corporeal form, people assume that such ideas are not true. I would rather say that they are not true enough, for these are conceptions of a kind that have accompanied human life from prehistoric times and that still break through into consciousness at any provocation. Modern man can assert that he can dispense with them, and he may bolster his opinion by insisting that there is no scientific evidence of their truth, or he may even regret the loss of his convictions. But since we are dealing with invisible and unknowable things, for God is beyond human understanding, and there is no means of proving immortality, why should we bother about evidence? Even if we did not know by reason our need for salt in our food, we should nevertheless profit from its use. We might argue that the use of salt is a mere illusion of taste or a superstition, but it would still contribute to our well-being. Why then should we deprive ourselves of views that would prove helpful in crises and would give a meaning to our existence? And how do we know that such ideas are not true? Many people would agree with me if I stated flatly that such ideas are probably illusions. What they fail to realize is that the denial is as impossible to prove as the assertion of religious belief. We are entirely free to choose which point of view we take. It will, in any case, be an arbitrary decision. There is, however, a strong empirical reason why we should cultivate thoughts that can never be proved. It is that they are known to be useful. Man positively needs general ideas and convictions that will give him a meaning to his life and enable him to find a place for himself in the universe. He can stand the most incredible hardships when he is convinced that they make sense. He is crushed when, on top of all his misfortunes, he has to admit that he is taking part in a tale told by an idiot. It is the role of religious symbols to give a meaning to the life of man. The Pueblo Indians believe that they are the sons of Father Sun, and this belief endows their life with a perspective and a goal that goes far beyond their limited existence. It gives them ample space for the unfolding of personality and permits them a full life as complete persons. Their plight is infinitely more satisfactory than that of a man in our own civilization who knows that he is and will remain nothing more than an underdog with no inner meaning to his life." End quote. So I think that's cool, and we really get more of the what appears to be a sort of pragmatic approach to religion in regards to the usefulness of it. And he says you can't prove it. You can't prove it one way or the other. You can't prove it for it or against it. And it is so useful in helping people through difficult situations. Why would we deny it to ourselves? And how similar does this sound to William James's Will to Believe? It sounds very similar. And this is many years after William James wrote that, so I wonder if Carl Jung read it and is influenced by it. Maybe. But it seems to me that if there is to be such a religion, it can't depend on us not believing what our senses tell us. And when our senses are extended through science and technology the way they are, then it's religion that's going to have to keep up with the rapidly expanding frontiers of knowledge. And that's going to be challenging for any religion to be able to do. To be able to still serve its religious function while not demanding that people believe things that common sense tells them aren't true. And empirical science tells them aren't possible or true. That is the challenge. Let's jump to the next section where he talks about the disenchanted modern world. He says, quote, "Modern man does not understand how much his rationalism, which has destroyed his capacity to respond to numinous symbols and ideas, has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from superstition, or so he believes, but in the process he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he is now paying the price for this breakup in a worldwide disorientation and dissociation. Anthropologists have often described what happens to a primitive society when its spiritual values are exposed to the impact of modern civilization. Its people lose the meaning of their lives, their social organization disintegrates, and they themselves morally decay. We are now in the same condition, but we have never fully really understood what we have lost, for our spiritual leaders unfortunately were more interested in protecting their institutions than in understanding the mystery that symbols present. In my opinion, faith does not exclude thought, which is man's strongest weapon, but unfortunately many believers seem to be so afraid of science, and incidentally of psychology, that they turn a blind eye to the numinous psychic powers that forever control man's fate. We have stripped all things of their mystery and numinosity. Nothing is holy any longer. In earlier ages, as instinctive concepts welled up in the mind of man, his conscious mind could no doubt integrate them into a coherent psychic pattern. But the civilized man is no longer able to do this. His advanced consciousness has deprived itself of the means by which the auxiliary contributions of the instincts and the unconscious can be assimilated. These organs of assimilation and integration were numinous symbols, held holy by common consent. Today, for instance, we talk of matter. We describe its physical properties. We conduct laboratory experiments to demonstrate some of its aspects. But the word matter remains a dry, inhuman, and purely intellectual concept without any psychic significance for us. How different was the former image of matter, the Great Mother, that could encompass and express the profound emotional meaning of Mother Earth. In this way, what was the spirit is now identified with intellect, and thus ceases to be the father of all. It has degenerated to the limited ego thoughts of man. The immense emotional energy expressed in the image of our Father vanishes into the sand of an intellectual desert. These two archetypal principles lie at the foundation of the contrasting systems of East and West. The masses and their leaders do not realize, however, that there is no substantial difference between calling the world principal male and a father, spirit, as the West does, or female and a mother, matter, as the communists do. Essentially, we know as little of the one as of the other. In earlier times, these principles were worshipped in all sorts of rituals, which at least showed the psychic significance they held for man, but now they have become mere abstract concepts. As scientific understanding has grown, so our world has become dehumanized. Man feels himself isolated in the cosmos because he is no longer involved in nature and has lost his emotional, unconscious identity with natural phenomenon. These have slowly lost their symbolic implications. Thunder is no longer the voice of an angry god, nor is lightning his avenging missile. No river contains a spirit, no tree is the life principle of a man, no snake the embodiment of wisdom, no mountain cave the home of a great demon. No voices now speak to man from stones, plants, and animals, nor does he speak to them believing they can hear. His contact with nature has gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that this symbolic connection supplied. This enormous loss is compensated for by the symbols of our dreams. They bring up our original nature, its instincts and peculiar thinking. Unfortunately, however, they express their contents in the language of nature, which is strange and incomprehensible to us. It therefore confronts us with the task of translating it into the rational words and concepts of modern speech, which has liberated itself from its primitive encumbrances, notably from its mystical participation with the things it describes. Nowadays, when we talk of ghosts and other numinous figures, we are no longer conjuring them up. The power as well as the glory is drained out of such once potent words. We have ceased to believe in magic formulas. Not many taboos and similar restrictions are left, and our world seems to be disinfected of all such superstitious noumena as witches, warlocks, and worry cows, to say nothing of werewolves, vampires, bush souls, and all the other bizarre beings that populated the primeval forest. End quote. The disenchantment of the world, and I just think that's really interesting. Matter, the difference between matter and the Great Mother. I think that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Could we re-enchant the world? Is the world re-enchantable without having to put our reason in conflict with our religion? What sort of thing would that require? Does it require something that transcends nature? Is that a requirement of religion, or can there be a religion that is entirely natural? And if it's unprovable either way, is it not the case that there are always going to be religions of nature and religions that are transcendental? I guess it's obvious that an unanswerable question will never be answered. So that's a lot of Jung. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll let you guys go. Hope you tune in again next time. Bye.